Introduce our first speaker, Kayla Korolek, who will present on understanding the lived experiences of social and community inclusion as facilitators of physical activity for people with physical disabilities in northern and rural British Columbia.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'll get my slides up. Okay. So before I begin, I wanted to start off by asking you all to think about a time when you participated in physical activity. For some, you could have went on a walk or a run, went to the gym, went skiing, or you could have played in a sports league. Once you've done that, I want you to imagine how your physical activity participation would change if you had an added physical disability. How much more time and planning would you have to do to still participate in that physical activity? What additional challenges and attitudes may you now have to overcome? Good afternoon. My name is Kayla Korlick, and I'm a fourth-year health sciences student here at UNBC. And today I am so excited to be presenting my research on understanding the lived experiences of social inclusion as a facilitator of physical activity for people with physical disabilities in northern and rural British Columbia under the direction of my supervisor, Dr. Chelsea Pelletier. I'll be presenting today from the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. So just a little bit of background information. So a physical disability is a physical condition that affects a person's mobility, capacity, stamina, or dexterity. 20% of Canadians over the age of 15 have one or more disabilities, where people with physical disabilities make up the majority of that 20%. We're seeing an issue of equity for people with physical disabilities and physical activity participation. Physical activity is critical in this population to maintain mobility, digestive function, decreasing pain resulting from their disability, and in preventing added comorbidities. The reason we're noticing low levels of social inclusion participation in this population is due to a number of social, physical, and environmental factors. These include barriers such as lack of equipment, variety, accessibility, and costs associated with physical activity. To help combat the barriers of physical activity participation in this population, the literature has noted that social inclusion is a facilitator for people with physical disabilities to participate in physical activity in urban areas. Now, social inclusion is the process of improving the terms of participation in society for people who are disadvantaged based on age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status, through enhanced opportunities, access to resources, voice, and respect for rights. In addition to facilitating physical activity, feelings of social inclusion have various positive health benefits, such as improving mental health and well-being. This is the first study looking at social inclusion and physical activity in northern and rural British Columbia, and few studies have looked at social inclusion facilitating physical activity in rural contexts. Interestingly, people who live in rural areas have shown to find connection through physical activity participation to their communities. Thus, understanding the relationship between connectedness and social inclusion through physical activity in people with physical disabilities living in rural and northern areas is particularly important, as this could be influential in helping to improve the health of this population. This brings me to my research question. What are the experiences of social inclusion as facilitators of physical activity for people with physical disabilities in northern BC? Just briefly on the methods here, I did an integrated knowledge translation approach with Spinal Cord Injury BC. For those of you who are not familiar, an integrated knowledge translation approach is a form of participatory research premised on the engagement of researchers and research users in conducting and disseminating research that is relevant, useful, and usable. Spinal Cord Injury BC helped to formulate the research question, incorporate ideas for the interview and demographic questions, and also helped in analyzing the data. Spinal Cord Injury BC also recruited entirely for this project, which I am so grateful for. I did 12 semi-structured interviews through Zoom and over the phone, which took an average of 47 minutes each. I had excellent representation of gender, age, region, disability, and mobility aid use. For example, we had 6 identified men and 6 identified women participate, individuals from 21 to 63 years old, and people from all regions in the North with wide ranges of disability like spinal cord injury, amputations, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy. I used an inductive thematic analysis approach using NVivo to analyze my interviews, and I did this by creating codes and then formulating themes from the codes to produce 4 themes, which I'll be talking further about now. The first theme which emerged was addressing ignorance improves access, with 2 sub-themes, responsiveness of establishments and making appropriate accommodations. Addressing and targeting ignorance looked quite similar for each of the interviewees. Most commonly, participants found that personally talking to establishment managers and employees about experiences in their spaces were helpful in creating sustainable changes. I always thought the word or ignorance to be a negative word, but the participants who spoke to me used this word not in a bad way, but to characterize people who have been lucky enough to never have had to think about the adaptations they face regularly. This idea puts the emphasis on people with physical disabilities to improve their own access, and it must be shifted to help facilitate improved health through physical activity in this population. By addressing ignorance, like educating others to become advocates and having inclusive physical activity workshops in different community sectors, we can shift the onus from people with disabilities to community members to improve disability access. One of my participants explained how they addressed ignorance in a social location in her community. Downtown at said social location, they have a parking spot right in front of the ramp, and there's always a truck blocking it. So I went and told them that. And within 3 days, they put up a handicap parking sign to open up that area. So that was really nice. They were super quick to respond. The second theme that emerged was advocating for changed attitudes can make a difference. This theme also saw 2 sub-themes: the role of advocates in providing education and awareness, and more availability. Advocates who provide education to able-bodied establishment employees foster improved attitudes towards disability and accessibility, which help to create socially inclusive environments. Further, advocates have worked to increase education on things like building codes, adaptive equipment needed, and unique adjustments for differing disabilities. In doing so, participants felt more included and more likely to participate in social and physical activity-based events at these establishments. As a result, participants noticed there were more things to do in their communities. One of my participants explained how advocates were influential in opening up an available trail in their community. Like there's a boarding kind of hiking trail at their location that a bunch of people, or some people through the community organization, kind of advocated to have that trail accessible, at least the bottom part of it. The third theme that emerged was promotion and community ties support participation, with 3 sub-themes: being involved, appropriate marketing strategies, and community supports. Having social networks, being involved, and being aware of events help to facilitate engagement for the participants. Some participants explained when they saw others with disabilities involved in the community, it motivated them to want to become more connected and engaged. Increased participation was noted when effective advertising of events and opportunities contributed to increased awareness and communication through partnerships and groups that already made them feel welcome and comfortable. For example, participants who are part of the Spinal Cord Injury BC community were more likely to attend a Spinal Cord Injury BC advertised event compared to an organization they didn't know much about, especially about their accessibility status there. So this idea of increasing collaboration with community organizations and disability-ran organizations is critical. Community supports included workers at establishments, volunteers at physical activity-based events, government structures providing funding for improved accessibility, and even friends and family who helped with any additional help needed. One of my participants explained how getting the word out about events in the right way is critical. Inclusive programming, awareness, and information. We actually do have some things, but the broader community is not aware of that. Having that information broadcasted would be critical. My fourth and final theme was which emerged was individual and community supports can foster physical activity. This theme saw three sub-themes: social motivation, individual motivation, and government policy involvement. Every participant explained how the COVID-19 pandemic decreased their social motivators as the public health orders restricted participants from seeing the people who motivated them to be active. Especially in the winter months, when being active becomes quite a lot more difficult in the north, some participants explained how critical social support, such as family, friends, and pets, was in continuing physical activities. Individual motivators, such as improved mobility, feeling better mentally and physically, were some factors that led participants to be determined to be physically active. Sometimes this looked like being a spectator at a grandchild's hockey game or going for a long run. Finally, participants explained when local community governments collaborate and listen to local disability groups and organizations, that accessibility needs in physical and social environments are more likely to be met. When this occurs, participants notice they were more likely to engage in physical and social participation due to improvements in accessibility spaces compared to when governments did not get involved. As well, a few participants mentioned that wheelchairs were provided by the government, but adaptations to make mobility easier, like prosthetic limbs, were highly costly. In restructuring funding policies like wheelchair and prosthetic limb funding for people with physical disabilities, the government can help provide appropriate adaptive equipment to help people with disabilities feel more included and to be better equipped to participate in more physical activity. One of my participants explained how influential government representatives are in making appropriate changes. They now have a board member who is very keen and very interested, and now things seem to be happening a bit more. So sometimes you need to find the right person that has their foot in the door somehow. So I have 3 take-home remarks for you all. First, attitudes matter. Individuals who are inviting, kind, and willing to be adaptive are the people who are most encouraging for people with disabilities to join into physical and social activities. Second, advocacy. We hope with these findings, we can communicate them to Spinal Cord Injury BC, who can then advocate for increasing accessibility in social and physical environments up here in the north. As well, we need to create advocates in our communities through educational and awareness workshops and socially inclusive physical activity training. Finally, physical activity establishments and government bodies can partner with local disability groups and organizations to encourage improved physical and social accessibility through collaboration with people with disabilities in these communities who are actually experiencing barriers to physical activity regularly. My question for you all is, how can you work on changing your attitudes, educating yourself, and advocating for people with disabilities in your everyday life to ensure inclusive communities up here in the north? And so that you will feel confident knowing if you had the addition of a disability to your life, that you will feel included and welcomed participating in the physical activity you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Kayla. Are there any questions? I think someone has a hand up. Okay, I'll ask a quick question, Kayla, while we're waiting. I'm curious if you have any takeaway lessons for everyone in attendance who may be interested in doing similar community partnered activities or in working with organizations, that any suggestions or advice for them in doing that kind of work?
Okay, just like the participants who've come here today.
Well, yes, to everyone on the call.
Okay. Okay. And sorry, so the question was just how we can work with collaborating with.
Yeah, if you had any key lessons or if you learned anything by working with Spinal Cord Injury BC, that would help others maybe do similar kinds of projects.
Right. Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is just listening and being active in the things that people with disabilities need and being receptive to what they need and stepping up to make those changes for them. So for this project, Spinal Cord Injury BC, especially through an integrated knowledge translation approach, really helped me to focus what they needed to be looked at and how I could help get some more information on what they need and how to help them further, I guess. So I think the biggest thing is just taking away anything that people with physical disabilities need and listening to them and making little steps to help advocate for the changes they need.
Okay, thank you. There's one question in the chat that I'll read out. Um, if you were to make a recommendation of who advocates should target with messaging or partnerships to improve the communities your participants live in, who would you recommend and why?
Great question, Mark.
Yeah.
I'll take a second to think about it. I think advocates should target different community organizations. So, for example, different physical activity organizations in Prince George, like the UNBC, the sports center up here. Advocates should try to target, and like the YMCA and different community run organizations when there's no COVID. Advocates should be targeting all of these groups, community led events, and getting in touch with disability groups in town. There's like Spinal Cord Injury BC, for example. It's all about talking with the right people and facilitating the appropriate collaboration that we can ensure maximum participation for people with physical disabilities by getting information on what we need, I guess. So I would say.
Okay, great. There's another question. Um, is there anything city council or the city could do to improve the experiences during the pandemic? So if there's any like low hanging fruit.
Yeah. A lot of my participants did chat about COVID, of course, because we've been living like this for a while. I would say they would like to see more from our community government levels in just addressing accessibility. I would just say that accessibility went down even further than it was before the pandemic for this minority population. So I think the government should even now look further into how we can maintain social inclusion even in COVID-19 times. I wouldn't say there's anything specific they said about Prince George specifically as a city to improve during the pandemic. I think there's a lot of things that are ever changing, especially right now. But that's what I would say.
Okay, thank you so much. There's a bit of another question here. Maybe you can address in the chat for Margot, but I think that actually leads very well into our next talk.
Yes.
Who is Alana Koopmans, who is going to share her study on the experiences of physical activity in people with multiple sclerosis in BC during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay, great job, Kayla, and thank you, Chelsea, for the introduction. So my name is Alana Koopmans, and I too am a health sciences student, and I'm also presenting from the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. And my supervisor for this research project this past year has been Dr. Chelsea Pelche. So the topic of my research is the experiences of physical activity in people with multiple sclerosis in BC during the COVID-19 pandemic. So just a bit of background information. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a chronic autoimmune disease which affects the central nervous system. And disease processes lead to varied symptoms, to things like vision impairment, loss of coordination, loss of motor function, psychological or cognitive impairment, and paralysis. There are many benefits of physical activity participation in people with MS. So things like improvements to MS symptoms, like fatigue or pain, improved mobility, increased muscle strength, and increased social participation. And there are more, I could go on. However, physical activity participation is actually lower in people with MS than the general population. So part of the reason that physical activity participation is lower is that there are some unique barriers to physical activity for people with MS. So examples would be things like symptoms like fatigue, absence of social support, inaccessible facilities, and in some cases, conflicting advice surrounding physical activity and multiple sclerosis. So we're all very familiar with COVID-19 by now, and maybe accustomed to some of the measures that have been put in place to restrict the virus spread. So studies looking at physical activity participation during COVID-19 has shown in the general population that physical activity levels have decreased and that time spent sedentary has actually increased. However, there's some mixed findings, and in people with MS specifically, we see these mixed findings. So we see some decreased physical activity, some maintenance, and some increased physical activity levels. So this leads to my research questions for this project. And these questions were, what are the experiences of physical activity during the COVID-19 pandemic among people with MS in BC? And what facilitated or acted as barriers to physical activity during COVID-19? So we recruited participants via social media, and we also posted recruitment information on the MS Society of Canada's research portal. Interviews were semi-structured, and we conducted them via Zoom or telephone. And we analyzed data using inductive and deductive reflexive thematic analysis. So all 11 participants were people with MS, and they were from various regions of BC. And their mobility abilities varied, so their use of mobility aids also varied. So in terms of physical activity experiences, there were 3 themes generated, which I've listed on the screen, and I'll go through each of them. But each of these themes had some themes to them. So the first theme was that there were changing opportunities and adapting to new COVID-19 with creativity and adaptation. Can you still hear me? I just got a internet connection is unstable. Okay, thanks. So here we see 2 quotes from participants where it shows creativity and adaptation. So the one participant in the first quote changed their living area to make it more like their dance studio where they used to do physical activity pre-pandemic. And then the second quote just exemplifies how participants use their own home in the months of the pandemic. And these new ways of doing physical activity, so whether that was online or at home or just increased time outside during COVID-19, there were many benefits to these new ways. So one benefit noted with online physical activity programming was it doesn't matter where you live, it's accessible and it's available. However, there were some drawbacks to some of the new ways of doing physical activity introduced through COVID-19. So that loss of that in-person group activity was missed by this participant exemplified in this quote. The second theme generated was social isolation. So for some participants, COVID-19 added to isolation that was already present for them living with this chronic disease. So the sub-theme for this theme was that physical activity is a connecting point. So for one point, it was a way to stay connected with friends and family during this time. So it was safe to go out for a walk and connect with others. So in one respect, it was a way to stay connected. However, the loss of social physical activity opportunities was really felt by other participants, which is exemplified in this quote. The closing of the pool for one participant was they lost the opportunity to connect with their mom and friends. And then the second sub-theme for this theme was that social isolation is not an exclusive experience to COVID-19 for some people with MS. So for some people with MS, their engagement with the world has been limited just because of their physical ability and for some cases, inability to work in a workplace anymore. So here we see a quote of an individual who's already been experiencing isolation from others, and this wasn't unique to COVID-19. And the third theme was fears and safety during COVID-19. So participants took precautionary measures to keep themselves and their families safe during COVID-19, and this impacted physical activity decisions. So there was concern and caution by many participants. So in the first quote here, we see that the concern voiced by this participant because of their health status, and then how their caution or risk assessment may have changed because of COVID-19. So they were asking different questions before going out for a walk. So who am I going to come into contact with? Will I get COVID and bring this home? And so on. And then there was a perceived sense of lack of sharing of information regarding COVID-19 and MS among several participants, and this added to the concern. So here we see a quote by one participant and said, the only thing would be, I guess, especially with COVID-19, would be the lack of information because they weren't sure whether they're at higher risk or not. And they got that information from the news, not from a trusted source necessarily. And then the second part of analysis, I categorized the facilitators and barriers to physical activity during this time, according to the social ecological model. So here across the screen, you can see the different levels of the social ecological model being individual, social, physical, and policy. So just highlighting a few of these examples, there are actually more that aren't displayed on the screen here, but one facilitator was having exercise or physical activity equipment at home already. That was the facilitator to activity during this time. Another was having friends to be active with, whether that was people to, like one or two people to walk with regularly or someone to connect with online to do activities together. And then an interesting one was living rurally, where one participant voiced that they were more comfortable going outside and walking and being active because they knew they weren't going to come into contact with many people because of their rural location where they lived. A few examples of barriers to physical activity during this time included the COVID-19 was a ready-made excuse, so that kind of plays into the motivating factor of physical activity, individual motivation. Another major one was closure of gyms, that many participants brought that up. And then the idea of isolation came up again multiple times. So to conclude, participants were creative and adaptive in their physical activity practices during COVID-19. Social isolation in some people with MS was actually not that unique during this time of COVID-19. And the social aspect of physical activity was missing for many participants during COVID-19. So the study highlights the need to address some of those persisting barriers to physical activity for people with MS that were highlighted through this project, but have also been seen in other literature. And then the social aspect of physical activity is really important, especially when developing future programming or interventions. So I'd just like to thank Dr. Chelsea Pelche for all her support and guidance over the past year as my supervisor, and then Dr. Caroline Sanders for her role as second reader to my thesis, and the groups who allowed me to post recruitment information. And a big thank you to all those who participated. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alana. Are there any questions? Please feel free to add them into the chat. I'm a little interested if any of the participants reflected like kind of positively that there was more options available now that everyone's kind of shifted online. I know there are some ways it's made things more accessible. So I'm curious if any of them had comments about that.
Yeah, there were actually quite a few comments about that and how like online was actually really accessible and enjoyable for many people. Yeah, especially like those one participant who lived rurally, they really enjoyed that they didn't have to drive after like a tiring physical workout, that they could just do it at home and then be at home when they're done. So yeah.
Okay, there's another one here in the chat. So has the experience of COVID increased gaps for this population, you think? And then is there something we can learn going forward to help close this gap and address the barriers sort of long term?
Yeah, so one thing that came up through some participants was the idea that there was a lack of support during COVID-19. So I think that COVID-19 has highlighted that gap for sure. Yeah. Okay. I think moving forward, we can definitely learn from this study, but also can build upon it, especially in northern and non-urban locations, because I think there's a lack of research in this population group. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can do to move forward, if that answers your question.
Yeah, there's a lot kind of flowing in here. If you want to maybe pick one more and address it, and then you can deal with the others in the chat, maybe just to keep it moving so we have time for everybody.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just answer Margot Parks about people with MS went outside less during COVID. And I think that was another thing that sort of highlighted the difference between more urban and more or less more rural locations. So we saw this even throughout COVID-19, the sort of difference in number of cases in COVID. So some felt more comfortable being outside. So to answer that, I think lots of people were spending more time outside, actually, not less.
Okay,
But
thank you
that
so
also
much.
depended where, yeah, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much, Alana. Very well done. I think if you want to just answer the rest of the questions in the chat, that would probably be good. But I want to make sure we have time for everyone to continue to have time to get their talks in. So thank you.
Thank you.
So next we have Catherine Bailey, who's going to share her work with us on vitamin D and cognition in young adolescents in Northern British Columbia.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Bailey, and I'll be presenting from the traditional unceded territory of the Lheidli-T'enneh. Great presentations, Alana and Kayla. You guys are up to some really interesting research. So as said before, my thesis project is on vitamin D and cognition in young adolescents in Northern British Columbia. And before I get started, I'd just like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Jacqueline Pedersen, for her phenomenal mentorship and contributions to this project, and to thank my second reader, Dr. Tammy Klassen-Ross. So today we'll be going through my project. We'll start off with the introduction, methods, and then move on to the results and conclusions. So this project started with two questions, and they were: how common is vitamin D insufficiency among young adolescents in Northern British Columbia? And is adolescent vitamin D status associated with cognitive functioning? And these two research questions stemmed from a plethora of background research on vitamin D insufficiency, vitamin D and the brain, vitamin D and cognition in adults, and then in adolescents as well. So what is vitamin D insufficiency? Vitamin D is an essential nutrient for your body. You've probably heard about it talked about specifically with bone health, and then maybe a little bit with immunity, and a little bit with the brain, which is what we'll be focusing on today. And it's defined as below 75 nanomoles per liter. And factors that contribute to vitamin D levels within your body include diet, but more so sun exposure. So this week's great for getting your vitamin D, but in the north, we tend to not have the same amount of sun exposure just due to the latitude and the angle of the sun and the colder weather. Dr. Pedersen has found in her research that adults in Northern British Columbia typically have about 46% of them are insufficient within the summer, and then 63% in the winter months. So vitamin D and the brain. We know that vitamin D has some impacts in the brain because of the relevant macromolecules. So there's vitamin D receptors and then 1-alpha hydroxylase. And vitamin D receptors are found throughout the brain and the brainstem, in the deep gray matter, in the cerebellum, pretty much everywhere. And then they're both found in neurons and glial cells. And they're both really important in converting vitamin D into its active form. So vitamin D has many potential roles in cognition. It's really important for neuroplasticity, and it plays some neuroprotective roles within the brain. So the research that's been done for adults and adolescents, we'll just quickly go through that. So vitamin D insufficiency has been found to play a role in mental illnesses and neurological conditions such as schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, and depression. Insufficiency also increases the risk of dementia. And it's been found that vitamin D insufficiency has been associated with worse cognition in adults. So more specifically, global cognition, executive functioning, and visual memory. There's been very minimal research on vitamin D and the brain in adolescents, unlike adults, but there has been some. So we'll just quickly go through that. There's been some in development, and some studies have found that it plays a role in intracranial volume and in general activity of kids. However, the results are mixed on this, but there are even fewer studies and more mixed results on cognitive functioning. So some studies have found that it plays more sufficient. Adolescents have better visual memory and better executive functioning, but then other studies find that this isn't the case. And this inconclusive data resulted in us coming up with a study to investigate it further. So how did we investigate? First of all, we started with our participants and we recruited through School District 57 and through social media posts for participants aged 9 to 13, so about grades 4 to like 7 or 8 that resided in Prince George and the surrounding area. And what did they have to do? So it's a little bit of a different year with COVID-19 pandemic. So to keep our participants safe, we adapted the project so that everything could be done at home. So they had to complete a vitamin D test. And what we did was we had a little blood spot test. And the participants did it with their caregivers at home, and they sent off their little cards with their blood on it to Doctors Data Incorporation, who then did the gold standard liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry and got the results back to us that way. So they stayed safe that way. And then we did a series of cognitive tasks with the kids, which was really fun. And I think they enjoyed it as well. It's pretty much just playing games over Zoom for a while. Just to keep them safe and at home. So the task that they did was the Ray auditory verbal learning task. And what this looks at is learning and memory. And then the Ray Ostrith complex figure task, which looks at visual spatial constructive abilities and visual spatial memory. Digit span forward, which looks at working memory and the attention. And then the digit span backwards, which looks at complex attention. And then, then we did the verbal fluency task, and this one looks at language and executive functioning. So it was important that we looked at a series of domains just to figure out which parts may or may not be affected by vitamin D status. And then from these tests, what we did is we did some statistical analyses. So we used both inferential and descriptive analyses. The descriptive analyses were used for participant characteristics, so like demographic data, health data, vitamin D status. And then we used correlational analyses the plan was to use correlational analyses with subsequent multivariate analyses for the significant findings for the vitamin D status and cognitive scores. However, age was a huge compounding factor. As you probably would think, when you think about a 9-year-old, so about grade 4, to a 13-year-old, about grade 7, the difference is huge as throughout that developmental period. So to try and account for this and control for this, we used ANCOVAs, but this didn't quite do that. So then what we found was we decided to break it up into 2 age groups. So the younger age group of 9 to 10 years, and then the older age group of 11 to 13 years, and run t-tests between sufficient and insufficient groups within those to look at that and account more for that age gap between the 13 and the 9-year-olds. So what did we find? So out of the 42 participants that enrolled, we only had 27 participants have complete data sets before our deadline. However, we are extending the study to include these and more participants. The other 15 will be accounted for later. Just the vitamin D tests were not back in time. And out of these 27 participants, we had 15 female participants and 12 male participants. The mean age was 10.7 years, and they attended a variety of schools in School District 57 and some homeschools. So out of these participants, 13, so 48%, had sufficient vitamin D levels, so over 75 nanomoles per liter. But 14, so 52% of the participants had insufficient vitamin D levels, so below 75 nanomoles per liter, 3 of which had levels between 30 and 50 nanomoles per liter, and then 11 between 50 and 75 nanomoles per liter. And now the fun stuff. So what we found with the cognitive functioning. So again, when we looked at the entire group without accounting for age, the vitamin D levels did not significantly, there was no significance between test scores for the insufficient and sufficient groups. However, when we broke it into the younger and older age, we did find some interesting results. So for the younger age, the insufficient and sufficient groups had no significant different scores on the cognitive tests. But for the older age group, there was a significant difference for the visual memory test, so the Ray Ostrith complex figure task. And this looked at 3 different tests more specifically, so copy, recall, and percent recall. I'm just going to run this through for you guys to kind of know what I'm talking about. Pretty much how this task worked is we would screen share with participants, and they'd have a complex figure come up on their screen, and they'd copy it out for us. So their ability to copy the figure was then scored, and that's the copy. And then the recall, so about 20 minutes later, we asked them to redraw their figure from memory, and that's that score. And then the percent recall is just showing the 2. So if you look at the figure on the left there, you can see the difference between the sufficient and insufficient groups, with the blue being scores, the percent recall scores for the insufficient groups, and the yellow being the percent recalls for the sufficient groups. So in summary, as expected, vitamin D insufficiency was common, affecting over 50% of our participants in the sample. And similar to studies in adults, visual memory was shown to be better among those with sufficient vitamin D status. So this, again, was only true for the older group and not for the younger group. And it suggests that there may be important age or time-related effects of vitamin D status on cognition. So yeah, that's really exciting. And yeah, so looking at the literature again, it does show that, yeah, it may be more related to the older ages than the younger ages when reviewing the literature. The limitations of the study, so we had a fairly small sample size, but again, like I said, we are waiting on more vitamin D results and we'll be extending the study to increase the sample size. And then due to the small sample size, there's lots of influencing confounding variables such as sex, which will be accounted for with a larger sample size in the extended study. And as for the implications, yeah, we're able to further understand what the vitamin D status of our population is in northern BC. There hasn't really been any studies on adolescents in particular for vitamin D in British Columbia and specifically in northern BC. And it'll help also inform future research on vitamin D in adolescent populations, both in BC and not. And there's, as I mentioned before, very few studies done on it. So it's exciting to contribute to that body of literature. And yeah, it also, our findings from splitting into the younger and older age groups provide further insight on how vitamin D status may be important across a lifespan. Yeah, so thanks for listening today. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks, Catherine. Very well done. I'll just ask one quickly. Yeah. I'm curious if the percentage of your participants with insufficient vitamin D levels was similar to what is tend to be in the literature, or if, you know, it tends to be lower than or higher than what you see in other populations.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the literature wasn't necessarily looking across the board for what the vitamin D levels of populations were. In that way, they were more like supplemental or looking at different factors. So I can't necessarily speak for that. However, in older populations, for sure, that's what's seen is northern populations have significantly lower vitamin D status levels than those in southern areas. Yeah, so, to answer Molly's question on the correlation between vitamin D and the visuospatial tasks specifically. So visuospatial tasks use a complex layer or complex level of thinking in the brain, kind of like executive functioning. And this is kind of what's seen across the board for other vitamin D having these roles in these complex thoughts. And that's pretty much all I can speak to on that. There hasn't been a lot of research done more on the molecular level surrounding that, but because visuospatial tasks are more complex, that's why it may be associated with vitamin D. Yeah, so speaking to the stability of a vitamin D measurement, typically it takes a couple months for it to like shift and change. So we took, the test ranged from between like January and we tested into February. And there might, I don't think any from March made the cutoff deadline. So it's pretty stable. It wouldn't be like your 15 minutes of sun would go change your vitamin D status test today, as much as we'd like that to happen.
Okay, thanks so much, Catherine. Very well done and really interesting work. I hope you get to continue and expand. Oh, there's one more if you wanted to answer it quickly. If not, we can move on to last.
I can answer that in the chat if you guys want to move on.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Why don't you do that and then we'll move on to Zach.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so last but not least, we have Zach Vaughn, who will present on his work investigating the relationship between environmental xenoestrogen mixtures and reproductive hormones in Canadians.
Thanks, Chelsea. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Zach, and today I'll be presenting my honors project under the supervision of Dr. Annie Duchesne. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Lheidli T'enneh, and I'd like to thank the HRI and Dr. Peltier for setting up the seminar series and giving us the opportunity to present our projects. So, my original interest in Annie's research began when I attended one of her talks. She was talking about how estrogens regulate cognition, specifically around the age of menopause and throughout the menstrual cycle. Now, one aspect of her talk that really grabbed my attention was about these hormones and how there are chemicals in the environment that can actually act as hormones. And this is where I began my research journey. I started looking at these chemicals that we call xenoestrogens, and I was helping out with a few projects. And to really appreciate the relevance of my honors project, I'll first talk about endocrine disruptors, how we define them, and then the importance of estrogens for health. So one of the main ideas that I'd like to drive home today is that our endocrine system really is a physiological interface with the environment. So we have hormones that come from our body, but there are also chemicals that come from the environment that can act as hormones. And we call these endocrine disrupting chemicals. According to the Endocrine Society, an endocrine disrupting chemical is an exogenous chemical or a mixture of chemicals that can interfere with any aspect of hormone action. So the figure on the right here, on the left, is depicting the various endocrine glands distributed throughout our body. And on the right, it's a figure that's showing various sources of endocrine disruptors. Okay, so now that we understand the endocrine system is an interface with the environment, I'd now like to focus on the estrogen system in particular. So how are estrogens related to health? Well, first, the figure here is depicting the vast distribution of estrogen receptors throughout our bodies. And we can see that estrogen receptors go well beyond the reproductive system. Additionally, of note is that most studies on estrogen focus on women, but men, as we can see in this figure, also produce estrogens and also have a large distribution of receptors throughout their bodies. And in Annie's lab, we are particularly interested in the effects of estrogens on the brain. And to date, there's an extensive literature, animal literature, I should say, showing that estrogen administration can actually improve various forms of cognition. For example, studies have shown that the hippocampus is particularly susceptible to the memory and learning enhancements of estrogens. Also, research has found that in brain disorders such as Alzheimer's disease, there exists a large sex difference in the incidence and manifestation of various symptoms, and this is likely contributed to sex hormone differences. So considering the importance of estrogens for health and the brain, there's a considerable amount of literature on the effects of endogenous estrogens. However, to gain a comprehensive understanding of the effects of estrogens, we must look at estrogens that come from the environment as well. And these are called environmental xenoestrogens. So environmental xenoestrogens are a group of endocrine disrupting chemicals that primarily act on the estrogen system. And they're known to bind to estrogen receptors throughout the body, although at a considerably lower affinity compared to endogenous estrogens. So how are these environmental xenoestrogens coming into our body? Well, we'll take BPA as an example. So bisphenol A is a very well-known chemical, and there exists an extensive literature on the effects of, on health and behavior. So BPA, or bisphenol A, is an industrial chemical. It's used in many consumer products, and its exposure is quite widespread. So we know we're ubiquitously exposed to BPA, but where are these exposures coming from? So BPA can be exposed through the oral route by, say, drinking out of a plastic water bottle. You can also handle thermal papers, otherwise known as paper receipts, and you are dermally exposed to bisphenol A. And lastly, BPA has been known to be airborne, so we can actually breathe it in the environment. Now, what's interesting is that all BPA metabolites are excreted in the urine, making us able to quantify these metabolites. So a recent study by Pollock and colleagues, actually in Canadians, they found that increased BPA concentrations were associated with lower levels of estradiol, which is one of our endogenous estrogens, specifically in young boys and in adolescents of either sex. And I should mention that there's many other xenoestrogens. For example, there's some BPA analogs. Those include BPS, F, and AF. There's phthalates, parabens, triclosan, and phytoestrogens. And phytoestrogens can come from soy products. Okay, so I use BPA just as one example to showcase the many xenoestrogens that we as humans are exposed to. And to date, most studies assessing the effects of xenoestrogens on the estrogen system tend to look at these chemicals in isolation, such as the study by Pollock and colleagues that I mentioned. However, this does not reflect real exposure. So the figure here by Willie and colleagues is depicting a metric called the exposure load. And essentially this just counts the number of chemicals that individuals are exposed to. And the idea here, and the reason I bring this up, is because researchers are becoming increasingly aware of the current limitation in the literature regarding assessing these chemicals in isolation. So in this figure, let's assume a person in red is exposed to the same amount of BPA as a person in light blue. However, the person in red would then have been exposed to a variety of other contaminants. These could include all types of endocrine disruptors. So if we conducted a study on the effects of BPA in isolation, for example, a person in red may exhibit a completely different result compared to a person in light blue. Now, we may be able to contribute this difference to the exposure load, or the increased number of chemicals that a person in red is exposed to compared to a person in light blue. And further, I should mention that some research has found xenoestrogens to exhibit some type of additive, synergistic, or even antagonistic effect with one another, making studying these chemicals all the more challenging. Okay, so that brings me to the rationale for this present study. And I hypothesize that taking a mixture approach may provide a more ecological valid, maybe even a more useful method for measuring the effects of environmental xenoestrogens. So the objective of my honors project is to fill the gap of the literature by investigating the relationship between these environmental xenoestrogen mixtures and reproductive hormones in Canadians. So for this study, the data I obtained was from Cycle 4 of the Canadian Health Measures Survey. The CHMS is a complex design cross-sectional survey led by Statistics Canada and Health Canada with the overall objective to measure the general health and chemical exposures of the Canadian population. And access to the CHMS is through Statistics Canada's research data centers that are distributed across Canada. And luckily we have one here at UNBC. So for those of you who are not familiar with Research Data Center project, I'll briefly discuss the process. So first of all, one aspect to note is that all the data is there. They collected it in 2014 and 2015. However, much time needs to go into preparing and selecting relevant variables. So that brings me to variable selection. So this involves searching through CHMS codebooks and guides to identify relevant variables. This includes outcome variables, covariates, and variables for selection and exclusion criteria. So the xenoestrogens I'm particularly interested in here are bisphenol A, 4 parabens, triclosan, and then the reproductive hormones with a particular interest in estrogen. I would also like to mention that identifying covariates is also quite a timely process. So for example, paraben exposure is known to change with the seasons because it's a common additive in sunscreen, and people tend to use sunscreen more often in the spring and summer months. And this is just one of the many nuances that must be taken into consideration when assessing xenoestrogens. Okay, so current progress. So after I was finally granted access into the RDC, which was about middle of March, the first and arguably the most important process was consisted of organizing the data set. Now, this is a crucial first step that takes a considerable amount of time, but it's mainly to ensure the data is accurate. After that, I ran some descriptive statistics to create a descriptive table, a couple descriptive tables, I should say, and a few preliminary correlational matrices between the xenoestrogens and estrogen. However, these descriptive statistics were actually just vetted by a StatsCanada analyst yesterday, and unfortunately, I will not be able to share any of the results because I have not taken the time to look at them yet. Okay, so next steps. Well, the next step is to conduct a principal component analysis. This is a type of dimension reduction technique that will allow me to identify a few factors that will represent the mixture of xenoestrogens. And we expect that these factors may differ by sex and age category, simply because the type of exposure to these chemicals may change based on age and or gendered experiences. So one limitation with a principal component analysis is that we'll only be able to talk about the mixture of xenoestrogens as a couple or a few factors, and we won't be able to talk about them as chemicals that can interact with one another. So that's why we will be attempting to model these interactions using another technique that we're currently learning. Lastly, I'd just like to mention this conference. It's called Protected. It's happening in Ireland in middle of June, I believe. And one of the main topics is going to be understanding mixture effects. And for me, in my opinion, this is going to be very interesting because I'd like to hear other researchers' perspectives and opinions on how we can assess these complex mixtures of chemicals. Okay, so significance of the study. Well, first and foremost, I believe that our mixture factors from the principal component analysis will be able to better predict changes in estrogen and other reproductive hormones compared to, for example, the study by Pollock and colleagues that I mentioned before, that were just assessing xenoestrogens in isolation. And at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the importance of estrogens in health and cognition and emphasized that estrogen receptor distribution goes well beyond the reproductive system. So considering the importance of estrogens in health, as estrogen has been implicated in various health outcomes such as Alzheimer's disease and of course cognition, it is imperative not only to study the effects of our endogenous estrogens, but also to study the many xenoestrogens that we as humans are exposed to. Lastly, I would just like to mention that most toxicological studies to date have determined the no observed effect concentration by examining these chemicals in isolation. And I posit that taking a mixture approach may alter the current toxicological conclusions regarding various xenoestrogens and maybe even endocrine disruptors in general. Okay, and that's it for me. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks so much, Zach. If there's questions, please feel free to use the chat. I'm curious if there is, are you expecting any relationship like based on sex? Like, are you doing a sex-based analysis as well?
Yes, definitely based on sex. Not only because, for example, some parabens and some xenoestrogens actually they differ in exposure because, say, their parabens actually are known to be in personal care products. That's the word I was looking for. So there may be a gender and sex difference for that type of exposure. So yeah, I would definitely do expect something on the lines of some sort of sex or / gender difference. Yeah.
Cool. And there's a question for Margot, but as a quick follow-up, is there a way to control for like menstrual cycle phase? Does the health measures survey include that? Like, I don't know if that's a covariate you.
Well, I think the only variable, from what I can remember, is they ask if you have a regular menstrual cycle. So I don't think that would necessarily reflect the phase. But perhaps one of the newer cycles, they maybe have more in-depth questions on that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it changes every cycle. So there's a question here from Margot, if you want to take a stab at answering
it. I honestly don't know how to, I don't know why it's taken so long to address this. It could just be because studying the effects of mixtures is very complicated, and I don't know if researchers to date have figured out how we can best do this. So maybe that's something we'll learn at the conference. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I will say thank you to our students for sharing your work today. Congratulations on very great projects. Everyone just did very impressive work, and I think we all acknowledge how flexible and persistent you all had to be, just given the challenges of this past year. So congratulations, I think, on behalf of the School of Health Sciences and the Health Research Institute. Jobs very well done, and thank you for sharing today. And we wish you all the best on wherever you head to next. And thank you everybody as well for attending. The Health Research Seminar Series will pick up again in September, so please keep an eye out for announcements about our schedule for next year. Thank you for coming.